My name is Tom Schultz. I'm a board member of the Green Lake Conservancy. I'm also president of the Green Lake Bird and Nature Club, and got my fingers in a lot of pots in the Green Lake area, I guess, mostly nature related, conservation related. Thank you all for coming today. I'm really pleased with this turnout. When we first scheduled this thing and discovered it was Father's Day, we were a little nervous that might affect the attendance. But at that time, we were talking about having a second presentation with respect to Powell Spring involving Ho-Chunk. But so far, we've been able to find a speaker for that. So perhaps we'll be able to get something scheduled at some point down the road, but we'll let you know about that. Anyway, as you can see, and as you probably already know, we're talking about Powell Spring today. I'd be curious to see a showing of hands, how many people have already been to Powell Spring at some point? Pretty good, that's probably close to half. It's for those of you who have never been there, it's quite a spectacle. It's quite an amazing sight to see this massive spring just come flowing right out of the rocks, out of the limestone. It's got an interesting history too, as you'll see as we get through it. If anybody can't hear me, raise your hand and or yell out loud. I'll try to speak louder. It's up to you. Does anybody think I need a microphone?
Yeah.
Okay. That'd probably be helpful. All right, so Powell Spring is the most recent acquisition of the Green Lake Conservancy. I have here a map of all the properties in the Green Lake area that we've been involved with. A lot of the properties are held, the title or the deed I should say is held by the sanitary district. The Conservancy holds some of the property, but we've been a partnership ever since we started conserving properties in the Green Lake area. So we are fully partners, and we worked hand in hand in preserving and protecting the properties.
Sorry, time out, everybody. Should we?
Oh, this should work good. Testing, can you hear me? There we go, thank you. That should help a little bit, thank you. Now, some of these are properties that are open to the public. Some of them are sort of available for public visit, just depending on where they are and the status of the properties. But one like Mitchell Glen, for example, is only available on public tours a couple times a year. So you need to contact the sanitary district to get permission to attend those, and those are our bus trips that we have twice a year. And then we have some of the properties that we have are conservation easements, so we don't hold title to them, but we hold a conservation easement on them to protect them into perpetuity from development. But quite a few of the properties are available for public visitation, and if you don't know where they all are, you can go on greenlakeconservancy.org and get more information about all of the sites. There we go. So this Powell Spring area has been in discussion for a number of years. It's actually back in 2013 that we've made our first visit to the site, Just started preliminary talks about it, but it took like 8 or 9 years before we got to the point where we were ready to purchase the property. These are from our initial visits back in 2013. Here's a kind of an aerial view of the property to show you where it's located, and it's way down here, not too far from Mitchell Glen. Highway K runs along the southern edge of the screen here, and this is Highway A, and Green Lake is up here to orient you. No, I'm gonna just grab my laser pointer. I'll be right back. That'll make it easier to point things out on the screen. So this is Dakin Creek that comes in from the northeast. Mitchell Glen Creek runs into Dakin Creek, and they both flow into the inlet. Powell?
Is that the log property where that happens?
It's log property is up
Oh, okay.
kind of to the north here. This is Powell Creek. It flows out of Powell Spring and it flows into White Creek, which starts at another spring here, and those merge and then flow into the southeastern corner of Green Lake. So just to give you a rough idea, and I have another shot here that shows you the landforms. You can see the gorge there where Mitchell Glen is, and then Powell Creek kind of runs through a steep area also. It's a fairly good drop off. This is about 300 feet above the surface of Green Lake. So it's got a fairly good drop. And there's another shadow view. Shows those two properties again. For those of you who have never seen Powell Spring, this is Powell Spring, flowing out of the limestone and flowing down, immediately forming Powell Creek. And it's quite an impressive water flow. Depending on the time of year, actually, it does vary somewhat. Generally, the flow is the greatest in the late winter, early spring, after snow melt. And depending on waterfall and how dry it is, the flow can drop quite a bit. On occasion, rare occasions, it does actually dry up entirely, but usually not for very long. There's a little later view, starting to green up. Water level is a little bit lower there. So this is the head of Powell Spring right here, where it flows out of the limestone and on downstream. Here's a view. You can see how it drops quite a bit. There's a pretty strong flow in parts of the property. Powell Spring is about a 6-acre property, just a little over 6 acres. And here's a view from below as the water's coming down. And then down a little further, it starts widening out a little bit, and it broadens out, and it's fairly shallow there. And when we look at the old trail maps, that's actually where one of the trails, the Native American trails, crossed Powell Creek. As you certainly are aware, water, springs and waterways have always been important for civilizations throughout time. You know, both for drinking purposes and also for food sources. Some of their food came from fish that lived in the waterways. But a lot of animals also tend to gather along waterways, just naturally to come for drinks or other sources of food near the creek. The site really became developed and famous by Mr. S.D. Mitchell, Stephen Decatur Mitchell, who Mitchell Glen became named after. And we'll talk about a little bit of that history in a moment, but he developed the Glen and built a museum, log cabin museum on the property. He did a lot of collecting of Native American artifacts. And he was well known as a collector, so people, farmers and people in the area who found them would sometimes give or sell them to S.D. Mitchell. Yes?
That upper right is a postcard, and that's available on the internet yet.
Is it?
Yep.
That's great. Yeah, there are a number of postcards of Mitchell Glen. Some are probably more or less available than others, but my understanding was that he charged 25 cents for visitors to his museum and to go in and see the Glen. Here's another view of his museum. So he had artifacts in there. He also did some taxidermy, so he had birds and mammals. He was a rock collector. He had geological specimens. Yeah, probably quite a variety of things.
Tom, what era was that?
What era? It was around 1900, late 1800s. You know, he lived there for quite a few years, 59 years or something, I think. Anyway, because of the fact that he was so familiar with the Native American history there, because of his collections, he was frequently in touch with Charles E. Brown. Charles E. Brown was, was the state archaeologist in Wisconsin. And Charles E. Brown put a publication together in the Wisconsin Archaeologist publication in the magazine or periodical. He published this in 1917, and I forget how many pages, but it's quite a few pages of information about. It's called The Antiquities of Green Lake, and this map was in that publication. And you can see there lists a number of the sites. I highlighted Powell Spring in blue, so you can see where that is. And there were a number of Indian mounds in that area, not directly right at Powell Spring, but near there, mostly closer to the lake. But there was a settlement. I think number 15 there was a Native American settlement, Ho-Chunk.
What tribe?
Ho-Chunk were living, or also known as Winnebagos. But, you know, going back through the centuries, other tribes, you know, came and went. Here's a map that shows the Indian mounds in Wisconsin. So you can see they're kind of in the southeastern third or so of the state. This is the Green Lake area, so there was a concentration there. And then kind of up to the Wisconsin River. Here's another map that Charles E. Brown did in 1913, Indian mounds of the Green Lake area. And then I have a zoom in here of the southeastern corner, and Powell Spring and Mitchell Glen are down here. That's where the Indian mounds were located. I am not an expert at all on Native Americans or their history, but a number of us have learned quite a bit, just trying to learn more about Powell Spring. In about 1834, James Powell moved to the area. He was one of the first European settlers, first half dozen or so that came to the Green Lake area. And he established a trading post very close to Powell Spring. This is we don't have a photo of his trading post, but this is probably a similar one. This one happened to be in Indiana. And these pictures or drawings are not of Powell Spring or his Powell trading post, but just gives you maybe a rough idea what the interior might have looked like of the trading post. Unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of detail about it. It wasn't even there for very many years, maybe like 2 or 3 years. And then the story goes that James Powell was a kind of a difficult person and didn't always get along well with the Native Americans, and apparently they drove him out. He moved to Iowa, and they burned down the trading post. Associated with the trading post, he also had a blacksmith shop, like maybe about 32 feet away from the trading post. So we're trying to learn more about the sites. Here's an early map. In 1903 and 1904, S.D. Mitchell hand drew these maps, and his maps cover a much larger area, all the way up to Green Lake and well beyond, into Green Lake. But here's a portion of it that includes Powell Spring, and I did a kind of a colorized version of it to show you where some of these places are. So Powell Spring would be this blue dot right here, and Powell Creek runs down. This is where the Powell trading post was located. His blacksmith shop wasn't on it, but it was adjacent to it. So the blue areas are waterways. This is Mitchell Glen Creek flowing up into Dakin Creek. Mitchell has a notation on here, 300 feet above Green Lake. And the yellow markings on there are trails. And this was a section of the main trail that led all the way down from Green Bay, from Fort Howard in Green Bay, and it passed through near Oshkosh, Lake Butamore. It's often called the Grand Butamore Trail. And then it continued on at some point to Fort Winnebago in Portage, and on down to Prairie du Chien. Oh, I went back. This is a map that Charles E. Brown drew based on input from S.D. Mitchell. And this is Powell Spring here, and Powell Creek. The map is turned. The creek really flows more northward or north-northwest. But this is the location of the trading post and the blacksmith shop. I guess it says 34 feet apart there. And then there were some caches, which were holes in the ground where they stored things to keep them cool here and here. Here's a map of the Powell Spring property, about 6 acres, and I superimposed the Charles Brown map, based on Mitchell, on top of it to show, this is a 300-foot stretch that was shown on the map, and this is where the trading post was located and the blacksmith shop. And this was an old fence line, which is still there. The map, fence may not be the same, but you can still see the posts, and some of the fences kind of buried. So we have a pretty good sense of where the trading post was located. This is a sketch map done by John Mullett. John Mullett was the original surveyor in the Green Lake area and in a lot of southeastern Wisconsin. He was doing surveys in 1834 and 1835. So he probably visited the Powell trading post, which would have been happening. In fact, he has a little drawing. It's hard to make out on this sketch, but it might be the trading post right there near Powell Spring. It's hard for me to fathom how they accomplished this. The surveying back at that time, the travel was difficult. They used a chain like this that that they would stretch out to measure distances, and they used a device to orient the direction. But you can imagine in some places there were trees in the way, you know, there was forest, and there were marshes and lakes and so forth. So that's a whole topic for another presentation by somebody who knows more about the early surveyors. But anyway, he does have Powell Spring on the map and the Powell Trading Post. This was the first plat map that was drawn after those original surveys. The map wasn't done till 1857, 58, but Thomas Lee, right down here, the green dot is where the Powell Spring is. He acquired that property in 1838, as it's shown on the map. It was sold subsequently a couple of times before the Mitchells purchased it. Archibald Mitchell and his wife Laura, they purchased the land in 1861. And then later on they sold off, or I don't know if they gave it to him, I don't know what the arrangement was, but went to S.D. Mitchell, their son, one of their children, where Mitchell Glen is. So again, this is a green dot is Powell Spring. So the Green Lake Conservancy thought it was important to hire some archaeologists to come and check out the property a little bit. So we hired Seth Schneider and his team from UW Milwaukee, professional archaeologists associated with the college. And they came out, Seth came out and checked out the site, and they figured out an area to focus on. This is Powell Spring and Powell Creek here, and this was from the Mitchell, based on the Mitchell Charles Brown map. So this was the area that they surveyed, and they laid out a 10-meter grid and did test digs. These were the two fellows. Oh, did I lose the microphone? Is there a low battery or something?
Could have been a sound we had.
Is Christine here? All right, I'll have to speak louder, I guess.
You have to. Sucks.
So these were the archaeologists who came, and they did test digs. I don't know if you're gonna look for a battery, John. Yeah. So they did a whole grid of test digs around the property. One day they were out in there and did this work. This was a chip. I would call it a ceramic chip. They call it a shard that was found on the site during one of their digs. It's small. It's only maybe an inch or so in length. But it dated back, at least the style of the work back around the 1820s. So it tied in pretty closely with the Powell Trading Post. And then we were lucky enough to learn about a couple of metal detectorists, and they're actually sitting in the back of the room here. Tim and Roger, and they agreed to come out and help us survey the site, and the items that they found so far have been really amazing. I mean, we've all been astonished at what they've been able to dig up around the property, and they're kind of on hold right now because of the vegetation growth, but probably in the fall when the vegetation dies back again, they can do some more work out there. But we'll give you a little bit of a sampling of some of the things that they found. So they work with their larger metal detector and listen for the beeps and watch their screen monitors, and they're pretty good at being able to detect
All right.
Sounds like we're back in business.
That's good, because this is the exciting part.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for the announcement.
Technology, it's always a challenge. Anyway, they'll locate a general site, try to nail it down, and then they have a handheld device, a pinpointer, that they can use and poke down in the soil and help them to more closely identify exactly where the object is. This is one of the objects they found. I think this was on May 3rd, and they found a brass button. It was used by the U.S. military. This is pre-Civil War. This dated back to the 1820s when this would have been used. In reading some of the early accounts, S.D. Mitchell found some brass buttons at the site also. And these buttons, looking online, probably would have come from what they called a greatcoat. Here's a close-up of the button. I couldn't locate a picture of what a greatcoat from the 1820s would look like, but this is one from the Civil War. What it would have generally looked like. And some of the buttons were used on the front and some were used on the sleeves. And we haven't determined for sure which are buttoned, but these are samples that I found on the internet that are very similar, with an eagle on the top and a wreath on the bottom and the U.S. designation. We also found a thimble, and that apparently dated back somewhere around the 1790s. It was rather thin, and it was called a steel top thimble. On the top there was a little bump where the steel cap originally was attached that wasn't on there any longer. And then the guys found this item, which we have not been able to identify for certain yet. One expert that we heard from thought it was a button, the base of a fabric button. But I sent these pictures to, what's it called, the National Button Association. And it took a couple weeks, but I got feedback back a few days ago, and they said, no, they hadn't seen any button that looked like this. So what's interesting is this groove around the outside. It's kind of a concave. So, could it have been a pulley of some sort?
Yeah.
We don't know. It's hard to know what. I think Tim sent a picture of a little music box that had a similar pulley.
Uh-oh.
Oh, we're losing power again. So anyway, for now, that's a mystery item. They found all kinds of this type of item at the site. These are generally called square nails. They might have been made actually back in that blacksmith shop, but they probably were used in the construction of the trading post and also the blacksmith shop. We found all kinds of configurations of different square nails. These are some of the other items. We're thinking this might have been a harness ring, possibly from a horse harness. This we're not sure about. It's not very big. I think I have another picture. It only measures, a little over 2 inches, 2.5 inches in length. So some people thought maybe it was from a toy, a child's toy.
Yeah.
Maybe a little horse or a wagon or a buggy, who knows? If anybody has any thoughts, let us know. For now, we're uncertain about that. This was one of the larger objects that they found. This could have been a tine from an old pitchfork or some sort of tool that they used for farming or gardening at the time. It's over 6 inches in length. And then this was much smaller, a nail with a large head on it. then these items, this was a fairly large nail here. Who knows what this might have been used for?
Could be a Jew's harp.
A Jew's harp. Well, that's interesting. Interesting thought, yeah.
A musical instrument.
Yeah.
All right, this will be a quiz. I mean, some of you already know because we've had some discussion, but does anybody have any idea what this article might be? There's two angles of it here.
Wow. Is it metal?
It's metal, yes. All right, here's another hint. Well, actually, there's an identifier up here. It was called a ramrod entry thimble for a flintlock rifle. So here's a flintlock rifle, and so the ramrod is stored on the bottom of the barrel, and the base of it would fit into the stock of the rifle, similar to this one here. And here's some more examples of ramrod thimbles. So the ramrod would fit into that, you know, to be held in between uses. But I just found the condition of this item to be really amazing. Notice there's a little piece on the bottom here with a hole through it, and that was used. There would be a hole in the rifle, and there would be a pin that would go through to hold that ramrod entry thimble in place. So here's a hole also. So that would have dated back right around that same time also, you know, late 1790 or 1790s, early 1800s. Here's another item that they found, and this one is probably the most mind-blowing for us. We never expected to find it, although they found some other similar copper points in the area. This is a copper point. Tim is holding it there. It's nearly 4 inches in length. That was found on the same day when they found a thimble and the brass button. So this dates back, this is what the base of it looked like. But it dates back to anywhere between 5,000 and 9,500 years ago.
Oh my.
Probably an expert could nail it down closer than that. You know, I've heard a date 6 or 7,000 years ago. But that, I mean, that's really mind-blowing when you think about it. That's well before the Egyptian culture, you know, that we commonly think of. Mark?
So Tom, is there a chance that a point like that would have continued to be used through thousands of years?
It's likely, yeah. And even if it wasn't,
The whole chunk could have used
they
that.
could have used it, right? Now, when I did more research about it, you know, the copper culture, it's kind of interesting. You know, back in the, you know, 9,000, 8,000, 6,000 years ago, copper was quite abundant, especially up in the upper peninsula of Michigan. And so it was easy to find. They would find copper nuggets. And we actually found one ourselves that I'll show you in a minute, but this is sort of the region where copper artifacts have been found. But this is the area where most of the copper came from, up toward the Keweenaw Peninsula and upper Michigan. And at that time, those cultures did not have any knowledge or ability for smelting. You know, they were not able to smelt and mold the copper. What they did was hammer it. So they would hammer it thin into sheets, and they would fold it and hammer it and fold it and hammer it, and in that process build it up to making a spear point like this. This type of spear point that we had is called socketed tang. The base of it was made so it could go around a shaft, probably a wooden shaft, and could be latched on. This was from the Milwaukee Public Museum, and it said they have over 300 examples in their collection there of copper points. This type of projectile point. Mike? Yes?
Did they have any idea if they thought, this might have been traded here? So maybe it's that old, like, it hasn't been used here that long, maybe, because didn't they, Indians, or maybe
Yeah.
trade and?
It could have been. I mean, who knows exactly, but there were other copper implements also that they used also, like awls. And apparently, later on, after they started developing stone points, you know, chipped stone points, arrowheads as we think about them. The main reason for copper at that time was for making awls or fishing hooks. Things, because copper could be easily, you know, could be pretty thin and still be strong. Yes?
Okay. Copper is very malleable, and there was lots of copper implements that was in Mitchell's collection that ended up at the Oshkosh Public Museum. And I looked at all of them probably, 30 years ago, and there was plenty, and they traded back, and everybody traded, they bartered. And there was, those were put on spear points to spear the fish that were going along the edge of the lake. They called them dogfish, which I believe probably were carp or whatever. And, but there were various sizes, various lengths. And they would also kind of like heat the copper to, you know, bend it and, you know, shape
Anneal it.
Yeah,
Anneal it, as they called it, I guess, too.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's very malleable.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating, and like you said, spear points for fishing were common use.
Very
Apparently, the
common.
smaller ones were used on atlatls
Yes.
as
And
points.
they did have fishing, you know, fishing hooks.
Yeah, I have a picture coming up here. Well, this is the copper nugget that we found. It's often called float copper. This was found right at the site, right near the spring. And it was about maybe 1.5 inches in length. Solid copper. When you hold it in your hand, you can tell it's dense and heavy. So that was neat finding that there. Who knows how it got there? Whether it was through trade or, you know, the glaciers did bring some of these materials down from the north. So, you know, so sometimes they're transported that way, but a lot of them were done in trade, I'm sure, for other purposes. Here's a sampling of various types of copper points. And here's an example of how they might have accomplished this hand hammering mainly to get the sheets and folded, and as Diana said, sometimes heating it to perhaps strengthen it and make it easier to work. But this is how they worked with the copper. Whereas in Europe, apparently, they were later on, this was much later, but they were starting to do some smelting and melting of the copper. Yeah, these are copper fish hooks that were made. Because copper could be made thin, you know, you couldn't do this with stone very easily. Although there were some bone and stone used for some similar implements, but copper worked very, very well for that, or for making awls for piercing. This was from an early Wisconsin map, 1836. And it shows, well, I made a highlighted version here to show you the trails, the riverways. This is the Fox River coming out of Green Bay, or flowing to Green Bay, I should say. This is Green Lake, Lake Winnebago. But these were the yellow lines are the trails. And this particular trail, which is often called the Grand Butamore Trail, came down from Green Bay along the north shore of the Fox River and passed very close, right alongside Powell Spring. Likely because, you know, it was a place where people could go to get fresh water. And then there was another trail that came down the other side of Lake Winnebago through Fond du Lac that became the military road. And there are different versions of the maps that you look at, and sometimes, well, here's another one. This one, the other one showed the trails connecting here. This one, I mean, there was probably another trail that came over here south of Lake Puckaway and connected with this Butamore Trail. But Fort Howard is up here in Fort Winnebago and Portage, and then on down to Prairie du Chien. So a lot of those roads later became our thoroughfares, as you can imagine. They were developed historically hundreds, probably thousands of years ago, and then became some of our own highways through time. We don't know the date of this map for sure that I'm aware, but it probably predates those other maps from the 1830s. But it shows Green Lake here in Lake Winnebago. This one just shows a couple of trails that come from the Oshkosh area, and this one from north of there, from Lake Butamore, Lake Poygan area. I found this map, this photo online. It says 1909, construction of the military road, it was called, but a lot of that was done even well prior to that. This is a historic map, state historic map that's up. It has kind of information about the old military road. But there must have been more than one military road that connected some of these forts. And I don't know exactly where this one was from. We'll go back briefly to the map showing Powell Spring. This one was done by S.T. Mitchell, 1904. But it shows the creeks. But this would have been the trail that came off the Grand Butamore Trail or Military Road later on. And this one crossed the creek. Remember I mentioned that shallow area on Powell Creek. It probably crossed right there and then continued on the north side of what later became White Creek. Yes?
Did it cross on the Powell, on our piece of property on the 6 acres, or did it cross further down?
Probably just north of our property, the Powell Spring property. I'm guessing just because of where it's shallow. But I mean, it's a lengthy area where it's shallow, so who really knows for sure. Here's a geologic map of bedrock. And the rock where the spring flows out of is limestone, or really called Platteville Galena dolomite, which is a hard form of limestone, which formed over 400 million years ago. That's the green area on the map. This darker area is the limestone or dolomite, really, where the ledges east of Fond du Lac, it's called the Niagara Escarpment. It actually runs up through Door County and it goes underneath the state of Michigan and comes up. That's why it's called Niagara Escarpment, because Niagara Falls falls over it in Ontario and New York. But anyway, the dark area here is sandstone. That's, if you go into Mitchell Glen, that's primarily sandstone, and that's a little bit softer than the dolomite, so it eroded out a little more quickly. But Green Lake is located right about here. So that's right on the edge of, that's where Powell Spring is located, right there. Just briefly, I'm a bird watcher, so I thought I'd throw in some information about the birds, but there aren't very many of us who have really been to Powell Spring yet, but this has been collected over the last couple of years. the birds at Powell Spring. This is from eBird. This is on Powell Spring Conservancy. So you can see it's about 62 species that we found so far. And I fully expect that we'll add to that. Some of these birds, like Bonaparte's gull and pelican, you know, they weren't on Powell Creek, they were flying over the top. And when you're birding, you mark down everything that you see, you know, from the property. So not necessarily landing on the property. Here's a sampling of a few of the birds that we find there. Scarlet tanagers. All these birds can be found there right now. Great crested flycatcher, tufted titmouse, red-bellied woodpecker. Only these two, the top two, would be year-round residents. They would stay, they're non-migrants. We've done, since we acquired the property, we've done several cleanup work days, or work mornings, more accurately, at Powell Spring. And we've had volunteers come and help out, removing an old deer blind that was back on the property, some old fencing. There's the deer blind. It was in bad shape, obviously. We filled a big dumpster with all the articles, more even than what I show in the picture. This was only half full, maybe. There was an old fence along the south side of the property that we took down. There was a lot of metal fencing on the property. There used to be a bridge right down by, this is the spring, right across the creek, right by the spring, but we decided to remove that and make a better view of the spring itself. This was the same bridge after we removed the fence, and shortly after that we removed the bridge. And then on those work days we also built trail by lining the edge of the trail with pieces of wood that we would find laying in the forest. So that'll make it easier. We're really going to encourage people to stay on the trails themselves rather than wandering off and possibly destroying plants and so forth that live there. This was a bridge that we rebuilt. This had been there for a number of years, and they had replaced some of the boards and others were more rotted, and so we put new planks. I should give credit to Peter Vandervelde. He did most of this work. The timbers that they were on were still in good shape. So now there's just the one bridge that crosses Powell Creek. There had been a log cabin on the site that was built, we think, in the 1970s. And there had been residents there pretty much nonstop through the time since then. But we decided to get rid of the log cabin. We didn't want to be landlords, or didn't want to, have any buildings or structures on the property other than the bridge. So we had electricians come and remove all of the electrical supply, and then we found somebody who was interested in taking the structure and moving it away. So he came, this was last October, came with a tractor and a big trailer. They put beams, they dug underneath the structure and put some beams through for support, jacked it up and put it on wheels and carted it away.
It's an Airbnb now.
Or near Horicon Marsh is my understanding. Is that right, Debbie?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that structure was built by Mike Jankowski when he was young.
Mike Jankowski, okay.
I think he was building in the 70s.
Yeah.
I think he did build it.
He
Okay.
did.
He
told me he did.
Mike, Joe Norton built.
Well, anyway, it's no longer there.
He was together with it.
After they moved the house, the basement portion was still there. So we hired an excavator to come in. Actually, just last month in May, they came in and dug all of it out, loaded it onto dump trucks. This is all fencing. This was after what we found last fall and moved all of that away. This was found this spring on other work days. But we had Polish excavating come in with a backhoe and they dug out the basement. They flattened the whole area out and they installed these large rocks for a sitting area
Isn't that great?
that overlooks the spring. So it's a nice little area. And then over on the right here where he's working with the backhoe, he dug in some stone steps to lead visitors down to the spring itself. He deposited gravel, good sized road gravel underneath each of those steps, compacted it down, and all the steps overlap, so it's pretty neat now. Before this, it was just a slope. It was sometimes a slippery slope that you would walk down, depending how wet it was, so it should make it a little bit easier to walk down now. We found this old sign back in the woods. Powell Spring is what it said, and there was a pine tree on each side. Gary Hazelberg was there helping. For those of you who know Gary, he's quite a woodworker. And he volunteered to take it home and rebuild it. So he recreated all the letters out of wood and the tree symbols. And this was put up a couple of weeks ago, right there at the spring. So that's pretty neat. We don't know how old that was. Maybe it was the same time as the house, I'm not sure. Maybe at some point we can find somebody who knows the history. So as a part of this, we have an event coming up, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes, on July 1st, an open house at the spring. We're inviting people to, and we have a few invitations up in front here if anybody wants to take one along. But in preparation for that, we put together some essays about various aspects of the property, the natural history, early settlements, the trails, Native American trails, trading posts, and so forth. And this is all on the Green Lake Conservancy website. So if you go on the website, it's greenlakeconservancy.org/Powell-Spring-Conservancy. And then this page will be available. And if you zoom in, there'll be places at the end of these opening sentences where you can click on and it'll bring up a document with some pictures, some of these pictures that are shown here. But if you click on these little tabs, it'll play an audio recording of somebody reading that essay out loud. In this case, it was Berzeratsky, who has a great reading voice. So you can listen to those. If you want to click on to read the essay, you can do that. That's on the Green Lake Conservancy website. So our open house, again, is July 1st, Saturday, July 1st, in a couple weeks. It's going to be open from 9 to noon. And Burr's already put up a banner there at the entrance. This is Highway K. This is Highway K that runs across the front of it. The property is back here, so it's a hike of 4/10 of a mile to get back to the site. But we're going to have a shuttle available for anybody who doesn't want to walk that far to get you back to the site. We'll have the shuttle going back and forth. So that'll be 9 to noon on July 1st. So to orient you, this is Highway A, Green Lake here, Sunset Park, Highway A, County K. This is Brooklyn G Road, Prairie Road on this side. But this is where the entrance is here. This is Craig Road. which is a dead-end private road that goes back to some homes. Well, I guess that's the end right there.
Parking on K, right, the north side?
Yeah, good point. So we're not gonna be allowing cars in for the most part. You know, on a rare occasion, if somebody doesn't wanna ride the shuttle, if you have physical limitations, you'd be allowed to drive in, but otherwise, we'll be parking along the shoulder of Highway K, only on the north side. We wanna put up signs so we don't have pedestrians crossing Highway K. That could potentially be a problem. So we'll be parking along Highway K and shuttling people in and out. There'll be trails available. Board members and friends will be available for answering questions. We'll have some displays set up on the site. Some of the artifacts that we found we'll have on display there. Artifacts from the property. So it should be fun. Hopefully we'll have good weather that day. We have a rain date for the following Saturday if for some reason we have a thunderstorm coming through or something, but we're hoping that won't happen. Anybody have any questions about Powell Spring? Yes?
Once all the artifacts that can be found are found on the property, is there a thought on what the ultimate destination is for those artifacts?
We don't know for sure. It might be the Dartford Museum, the History Society for their museum. We're not entirely sure yet at this point.
There'll be a display of some of the items after July 1st, which will be at the Historical Society at Mill and South Street. So we also have artifacts that we have in the museum itself that we'll try to add to that. But this whole effort has really been a leverage for us to start to work on Native American history in Green Lake, which really hasn't been done that much before.
I can add to that. So I helped Tom with some of the research, and S.C. Mitchell donated over 300 artifacts, points, pottery, and the like to University of Pennsylvania. And it's there, it's probably archived.
Some went to the Oshkosh Public Museum, right, Diana?
Oh, yeah, and there were some that went to the University of Pennsylvania. He sold the collection there. He also sold another collection. I've got the letters, and I have the catalogs of what went where.
Oh, neat.
Oh, yeah, and my question to you, because I've done Mitchell Glen, tours on and off for years. And even when I was at Ribbon College and studying of that whole area, I kind of focused on that for my anthropology degree. Lately, I'm getting older, you're all getting older. And
Yes.
when you go down into the Glen, and you're gonna go down into Powell Creek, I used to tromp around back without worrying about, I would grab onto trees, that was it. But are you going to put in handrails?
On a stone? We're talking about a big rope like we have at the Glen.
Okay, but that's very important. People
Yeah.
can get down, but coming back up, and you need to get more benches, because, it is. That's kind of why, sometimes if it's gonna be raining or slippery, I will back off on the Mitchell Glen tours.
Yeah.
I do not need to slide down, I'm not 40 years old.
Good point.
It's, it's been a while.
Gene, do you know if that's gonna happen?
Oh, yeah.
Before, we're going to have people, volunteers on those stairs helping up and down
Up
that
and
day.
down, okay, thank you.
Please know that if you're hesitant at all about going down these steps, and I've been up and down them quite a bit, I'm not saying I'm a marathoner by any means. But I will tell you, the view from up above and those sitting rocks is spectacular. So that alone is worth coming. We'll have a welcome tent, we'll have a little bit of the history up on top to accommodate anyone who cannot get down to where from. It's gonna be where the proposed trading post site is or was. So for that to cover, but the up above, the rocks, sitting rocks up there, it's spectacular, it's beautiful.
Yeah,
You've been in contact with Bill Sandberg.
he was out there with us, one
Okay,
day.
he was, okay,
Yes.
because he's deer hunted out there for years and years and years.
Yeah.
And he remembers seeing the charred timbers.
Yeah, he told us about his hunting and sometimes being frightened because bullets are flying around.
Oh, I'm sure, okay.
So, but we're not gonna allow any hunting on the site, but the neighbor, well, to the west and to the north certainly allow hunting, and we'll probably put up a sign to discourage visitation during the 9-day hunting season. It's, it'll be a risk otherwise.
Hey Tom, if anybody's interested, we have a sample of a flow copper that we found at Sugarloaf, but it's very similar to what we found at Powell Spring.
Oh, good.
If you want to feel it, the density of it.
Why don't you guys stand up? Roger and Tim, these guys are our metal detector guys. These guys, they deserve so much thanks because they have volunteered. They've been doing this for a number of years. Tim for probably more years, but they have great equipment and knowledgeable, and they have just willingly shared their time and expertise to discovering what we can at the site. It's just been tremendous.
Well, it's a thrill to have the opportunity to do a historic site like that. So, I mean, that's what it's all about. Saving history.
We're going to really try to prevent others from coming in. We're going to prohibit other metal detecting other than authorized, these guys, because we just don't want people going in there and, digging for things and so forth. So we're discouraging that unless authorized. We don't want it disturbed. Yes?
So this water that comes out of limestone, is this water underground and it like works its way up and through? Is that what happens?
Yeah, I wish we knew, wish we could see underground and know what's happening, but it's limestone has fissures in it and cracks, and it must have been a networking of fissures that came together and then gradually increased over time, the flow to this one isolated emerging point. But it's amazing when you think about how those springs must work. Yeah.
Is the water drinkable?
I wouldn't drink it. It's coming from farm fields now. Historically, I'm sure when it was all native prairie, it was a great source of fresh water, but I wouldn't risk it nowadays.
For impurities that are coming into the lake?
There is periodic sampling of the creek and other streams downstream. I haven't seen the results to know exactly how much phosphorus and so forth. Because it's coming from farm fields, I'm sure it's got phosphorus in it. Probably bacteria. There are pastures and so forth upstream, cow lots.
All those streams have been monitored continually for years out in Dakin Creek and all of them. So there's a big database that covers the water quality and flow.
Yes?
Hi, I'm Dave Byrne from Ripon, and I'm the one that restored the Bone Steel Cemetery on County Highway 8 toward Markezan.
Oh, okay.
And during that time, delved into history that's fascinating. And one of the things I found online was in the Wisconsin genealogy trails is the settlement of Green Lake County by Anson Dart's son.
His son, yes.
And it is the most fascinating reading because you could practically stand up on Wayne Albright's farm and look to the west and read this and point out things in this article, and includes Powell Spring
Yes.
in it. And, it's just a fascinating story about it.
That was one of our sources of information, definitely.
Yes. And then,
He was there.
as far as artifacts go, I have a picture of a stone my grandfather found, which would be a mile northwest of Mitchell Glen.
Hmm.
And, I can't get it away from my cousin, so. It's a quartzite stone. This is about twice the size of it, and it's got a crane on it or egret on it.
Oh, I see.
Holding a,
Crook had that.
yeah, Mabel Crook.
Mabel Crook.
Yeah,
I saw that years
yeah,
ago.
yeah, that's the one.
Wow.
And, sure, you can pass them around, take a look at it.
Yes.
Would that have been private property at the time that someone was allowed to build that log cabin? in the
I'm
area?
sure it was, yeah. I don't think it's ever been public until recently, but a lot of people just went there. Yes,
Okay, did Elaine's stores or build that?
yes,
Thank you.
that's good to know. So Jim Jankowski built it for Elaine.
Yep. Okay, I remember that.
Thank you for mentioning the military road, and what did you call the one that came from?
The Grand Butamore
The
Tree.
Grand Butamore. I grew up on, I was blessed to be raised on a farm off of Town Line Road, or on Town Line Road, so that's the third road north, going towards Berlin. And that was known, my parents would have torn this building down to build the house that I grew up in. And it was called the Halfway Inn. And it would take a team of horses from Green Bay to the Halfway Inn. They'd spend the night, get a fresh team of horses, and head on down to Portage. And so that house too has held stories, and we have wonderful photographs of that. So, yeah, to have that all tied in is wonderful.
You know when about that was built?
I can find out, because I've got pictures. We need to get that all to the Historical Society too.
Yeah, you would appreciate that, for sure.
Yeah, we'd love that.
All right, I'm happy to answer questions later on. There are other members of the Conservancy Board here, and we can help you out. But go on the Green Lake Conservancy website for more information. Yes?
Another good source of history is this book, Portrait Biographical Album of Green Lake, Marquette, and Washoe Counties. And it's written in 1889 or something like that, but it lists, at that time, all the early settlers, farmers. It's got the presidents in it. And I believe that Green Lake has a copy of this book.
I think we do.
Yeah, and it's fascinating history in there.
Is it still available, do you know?
Yes. Yes. You just bring up settlement of Green Lake County.
Well, thank you all for coming today and taking part in the conversation.